Look, when this was advertised, I read with some surprise that what you could expect was David Rush, an authority on the ecosystems of the Illawarra Escarpment, coastal plains and plateau areas. I am not an authority, but we do have an authority on rainforests here tonight, and that person is Dr. Kevin Mills. So I'm always a little bit hesitant about accepting these sorts of accolades, which are not quite accurate, particularly when we have the likes of Kevin Mills in the room. So I just wanted to point out that yes, I'm a conservationist. I've been a project manager for Bush Connect projects in the past here in Robertson, the Thin Green Line, the Berry Bush Links project. I run my own business, which I run land for wildlife assessments for in the Illawarra Shoalhaven and now the Eurobodalla. And I still work on some private properties. I still do the hard yards, removing weeds, controlling foxes and whatever not else. I'm happy to do that sort of stuff because I think our voiceless threatened species and wildlife need a voice and they need support. So anyway, I just wanted to point out I'm not an authority, but I'm very keen on the escarpment areas. And the reason why we started the Thin Green Line project in the first place was because it was regarded as something special. So, what's so special about it? I'm glad you asked. In 2015, the New South Wales Environmental Trust rolled out $8 million in funding for grants up to $500,000 under the Bush Connect program. These were 10-year programs of environmental investment directed at Great Eastern Ranges regions in New South Wales, from the north of New South Wales down through into the Shoalhaven area here, the Highlands, and down to the Victorian border. We were fortunate enough to get 2 of these grants. It funded me 2 days a week in each of the projects, the Thin Green Line and the Berry Bush Links project, which was good because 2 days on one project wasn't going to be enough to pay the bills. So getting 2 of the projects was great. And we were the only region in New South Wales to get 2 funded projects. So that was pretty special. So 18 projects were funded and our project here in this area was called Thickening the Thin Green Line of the Illawarra Escarpment. But that's a real mouthful, so we just used to call it the Thin Green Line. Now this project focused on an area that's known as the choke point of the Illawarra Escarpment, just east of Robertson here. This is regarded as the thinnest point of forest connectivity between Newcastle and the Victorian border. And if you look at this map of New South Wales, you can see Newcastle up here. That's the valley that takes you up through all the coal mining areas. This is largely treeless plain areas now, but you can see the dark areas of forest. And then as you come down south of Wollongong, you get down into this area and you see this choke point of forest here on the coastal escarpment. There are some forests a bit further to the west of Mossvale area. They also have some choke points in them as well. But then you end up with some larger forest areas again until you get down to the Victorian border and you're into areas of Albion National Park and other large forested areas. Not all of these areas are reserved or national parks or nature reserves. Some of them may be Crown lands, some of them may be state forests, but at least they're still existing connected forests, and that's the sort of main thrust point there. So we're interested in this area here, so we'll drill down a bit further. Here we are, Albion Park here and Robertson sitting in here somewhere, and it's this area here that's of particular interest and concern. Just out of interest, the Berry Bush Links project was operating in this area around Berry to try and connect up patches between 7 Mile Beach and the escarpments upland from Berry. And then we drilled down a little bit further to more of an indication of just what we're dealing with here. So this is the point. And so your escarpment runs along this area here, and you've got Tongara down in this area here, and you've got the plateaus areas here, Carrington Falls and so on, plus deeply dissected by, I think, places like Upper Kangaroo River Valley, Belmore Falls, Barren area, upper Jamberoo mountain areas here. And of course you've got these large forested areas, the Sydney Catchment Authority lands up in here, and then you've got Budderoo National Park in here, and then Barren Grounds further down. And of course Morton National Park out through this way here as well. So these areas are fairly well connected and good and thick forested areas, but this is the choke point here. And the reason why...
What a choke point is.
Yeah, so I'm talking about connectivity and long-term forest connectivity for wildlife movement, effectively. So you have national parks here, and of course the Sydney Catchment Authority lands up here. So they're locked off lands, as many of you probably know. Their access into them is not easy, which is one of the reasons why they're still relatively well intact. You've got the Macquarie Pass National Park area here, Budderoo, Barren Grounds, Morton. So this is a choke point because it's a gap between reserved estate lands, which means that these forested areas are potentially in jeopardy of change in the future. Okay? Missing link. Choke point, narrowest point of forest connectivity between Newcastle and the Victorian border. That's probably one of the take-home messages from tonight, yeah? Why is that important? The reserved estates are critically important areas, not only in Australia but around the world. The IUCN Commission 22 that indicates that on their own, these reserved estates, national parks, nature reserves and so on, will not be capable of limiting threatened species extinctions on their own due to their fragmentation and climate change impacts. Okay? So that's a pretty serious statement for the IUCN to make, I think. And this is a few years old now, but this gives you an indication of what the reserved estate looks like in Australia, probably about 10 years, 15 years ago. Green being the National Park Reserve System, the big blue areas in central Indigenous protected areas. There's private conservation lands around the country, mostly in New South Wales, some in Queensland and Northern Territory and South Australia, and also World Heritage areas. But the thing that I notice about this is, even though you've got some very large areas and they're fairly well connected in Central Australia, look at the fragmentation around the rest of Australia with the reserved estate. And that's the issue. These areas, they're really important for wildlife, but they're not connected. Okay? In New South Wales, and this is a map of eastern part of New South Wales with some Western Plain areas, this map effectively shows the capacity in New South Wales, the red areas being highest level of connectivity capacity. So you can see that in some areas this is Newcastle here, so this is the big barren area of the valley west of Newcastle. And then you've got relatively good areas of National Park Estate, and you come down toward the Illawarra and the Illawarra Escarpment here, and then it starts to get a bit broader again further south. And I think the reason why this is so well connected, and this is not necessarily forest, but it's probably woodland, arid woodland, grasslands, that sort of stuff in western New South Wales, but still relatively intact. But a lot of the central area largely cleared since European invasion. Now, this connectivity is important because with these threats, habitat loss and continued fragmentation, invasive species, human population expansion, and the impacts of climate change, and they're varied, the escarpment forests in eastern New South Wales are really important because they do provide the ability for wildlife to move to deal with these threats, these issues that they're dealing with. Okay, and that movement is not just north-south, because it's quite well connected, generally speaking, north-south, but also from lower altitudes to higher altitudes. And this is important because what was last May? The hottest May month on record, globally. And that was a record-breaking month. But remember last year we were talking about the same thing, and the year before that, and the year before that. We're just continually breaking records of hotter and drier months, and this is impacts of climate change. But apparently, according to some, it doesn't exist. So species need the connectivity, but they also need the ability to move to cooler areas, mountainous areas, to deal with climate change impacts. Okay? And I won't read these out for you, I'm sure you can read them yourself, but this is why the Great Eastern Ranges of Eastern Australia are so important. It's got some of the most exceptionally amazing landscapes, and my wife and I were very much pleased to visit the Blue Mountains recently and enjoy some of that. We really got into our bushwalking and took lots and lots of photos, and we saw lyrebirds dancing and doing their thing and all that sort of stuff. It was wonderful. And I took photos of birds and that sort of stuff, and I logged all my observations on iNaturalist. So the Great Eastern Ranges are exceptionally amazing landscapes. More than half of Australia's threatened wildlife live there. They are biodiversity hotspots for our mammals, birds and flowering rainforests. That's where we get most of our water from. They're rich with culture and they offer wildlife the best opportunity to move. In terms of species richness, where it's reddest is where the most species richness is in terms of wildlife. And not surprisingly, the eastern seaboard's quite rich. So this is the area between, not just generally known as the Great Eastern Ranges, but between the Great Dividing Range and the Eastern Escarpment, the Great Eastern Escarpment. And it's also, the same area is also where we find the most species endemism. In other words, animals that, or plants that only occur in that area and nowhere else in the world. And I was reminded tonight by Alan Stiles that the Carrington Falls grevillea is such a plant, but it's nowhere else in Australia or in the world. So there you go, endemism. And so when it comes to endemism, remember in that previous slide, the Great Eastern Ranges contains the highest concentration of primitive flowering rainforest plants in the world. So rainforest is a key word that keeps finding its way through this presentation tonight. Now I hope we can see that map reasonably well. It looks a little bit bright, but basically what we're looking at there is the vegetation communities between Robertson and Albion Park. So Robertson being over here, Albion Park over here, the escarpment along this area here. And so it indicates the different colours indicating different vegetation communities. And this map comes from the skivvy layer in the seed database, which is freely available for anyone who wants to have a look at it. skivvy stands for the South Coast Illawarra Vegetation Integration Project. It's a regional classification and mapping project by the New South Wales Government, and it covers the South Coast Illawarra and parts of the eastern tablelands in New South Wales. Note the complexity of the vegetation types. Different colours, different vegetation communities. And it's very rich in here, in and around the escarpment. These are not all of the different vegetation communities, but I've really focused on the escarpment area and just on top of the escarpment. So you can see that it's got Yarra temperate rainforest, which is your Robertson rainforest. Also, you've got other rainforests that are popping through. There's shale basalt sheltered forests and the sorts of forests that Kevin Mills talked about previously in this room about a year ago, I remember. Very fascinating talk about those different types of shale forest, woodlands, plateau heath and so on. And then below the escarpment you've got some more forests and plenty of rainforest popping up again as well. So it's pretty rich area when it comes to vegetation communities. So what more can we find there? There's these wet sclerophyll eucalypt forests, the tall eucalypts. We've got subtropical rainforests. We also have warm temperate rainforests, just to name a few. I'm only touching on some of them here. So in terms of escarpment rainforest values, I'm reliably told that there's 44 threatened flora and fauna species in the escarpment area, and there's just a list of some of them. And what I've done there with that list is I've included species that are not just listed in New South Wales, but also by the Commonwealth. There's still a whole bunch of other New South Wales threatened species that are not listed in there, because that's obviously not 40. But I think important is that we're talking about what's left. These are, the escarpment forests are down in terms of what was there originally. And fauna are playing a really key role in terms of the functionality of these ecosystems for the nutrient cycling and seed dispersal, particularly when you're talking about animals like the grey-headed flying fox and other very mobile animals distributing seed and playing a really important role in being able to get stuff spread around the landscape. And interestingly here, it talks about even patches that are only 0.1 of a hectare in size, as long as they're intact, they still have significant conservation value. They're still important sites. And even if they're a bit degraded, even if they're a little bit weedy, they are still important sites if they're looked after. Okay? Remove the weeds and control the ferals. And particularly if they still have their canopy cover, they're worth protecting. And there are not many large intact patches in the landscape anymore. Very sad. A lot of clearing over the years. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the animals that we'll find in the escarpment forests. Long-nosed potteroo, powerful owl, the broad-headed snake. Now, have any of you been on a talk about the broad-headed snake before? Anyone? Did you know that this is Australia's only endangered snake? There are no other endangered snakes listed in Australia that I'm aware of. It's not a very big snake. It lives in escarpment areas where there are open sites of rock platforms, and they like to hide under some of the loose rocks, and they feed on geckos and other lizards and things like that. They're still poisonous, they're still toxic, they can still do you some damage if they bit you. This plant is in the Tongara area. It's called Solanum salatum, and it looks a little bit like the forest nightshade that we get on top of the escarpment here, but a little bit different. Prefers the warmer, more subtropical rainforest areas. I think that one is the stuttering frog, or it might be the burrowing frog, I can't remember which. And of course the spotted tail quoll. And that's just a few of the species. So then we go above the escarpment. What are some of the things that we might look at? What I want to focus on tonight is Robertson rainforest. And that's from the nature reserve here in Robertson. As you know from the book, the Robertson Rainforest, edition 2, this is the mapping of the sites of Robertson Rainforest. So it's the yellow patches, and then in the pink, it's where the basalt is, the pink areas, and yellow is potentially where Robertson Rainforest could occur. So it's a broad area, but a lot of that, I think, where it could occur or may have occurred in the past, this indicates that there's been quite a reduction in the distribution of Robertson Rainforest to where it used to be. So huge impacts on Robertson Rainforest, yarra brush. What are the values? Some of the same species are popping up that we saw in the previous one for the lower down on the escarpment forests. Animals like the quoll, long-nosed potteroo, grey-headed flying fox, stuttering frog, large-eared pied bat, southern brown bandicoot, broad-headed snake, but some different ones as well: koala, eastern bristlebird, Little John's tree frog, the bristly shield fern, and so on. There's plenty of others that I didn't list here. Less than 25% remains of Robertson rainforest than what used to be around. Again, the fauna play a key role in the functionality of the rainforest, again through these same processes. And this, I won't dwell much on this one because I think Kevin's all over this forest community. It's an important area, this Southern Highlands shale forest and woodland. There's 3 types. There's a wet, there's a what they call typical, which is a funny word to use, but they call it typical, and then there's the dry. This map indicates in the Wingecarribee area, Shire Council area, where those patches of shale forests occur. And again, notice that it's all fragmented. There's not, up here it's reasonably well joined with larger patches, but throughout the rest of the area, particularly as you go further west, they're smaller and fragmented. Unfortunately, this is the story of many of our forest communities. And so here we have the spotted tail quoll popping up again, potteroo, koala, pied bat, Now we have some scarlet robins, powerful owls, regent honeyeater, Rosenberg's goanna. And so the other values of these southern highland shale forests, obviously Robertson rainforest will do the same thing, keeping temperatures colder. They are carbon storage areas. They filter and maintain aquifers, really important for that ecosystem services, mitigating local flooding and soil loss, pollution. They're really nice areas to see, especially when they're intact. They're beautiful. Any area that's natural is nice to walk through and enjoy time in. Of course, soil health, and so the spin-offs for nearby agricultural areas are obvious as well. I used to sell tree planting in the Braidwood district under the guise of wind shelter belts for stock. They were wildlife corridors by another name, but as a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So you use what you can to get the message across, and of course they are very good for windbreaks, so what the hell, right? But again, the patches that remain, they're important stepping stones, good for wildlife corridors and movement and so forth. And then there's the Robertson basalt tall open forest. Now, I don't have a very good map for this one, but the map that I did find indicates that this is the zone where it can be found. So it's got a fairly broad area, not just the top of the escarpment areas and west of Robertson, but also down in some of these areas a bit further south as well. Now, all of these areas have very common threats. Habitat loss and fragmentation is not just the biggest one, but it's often the one that's mentioned first when we talk about the threats to our native vegetation communities. And the problem is when they're fragmented, unless you're a really mobile animal like a large bird or something like that, then moving between patches, stepping stones of forest areas is difficult. And if you're a small animal and you're subject to predation, you put yourself in a great danger to cross those areas. And maybe you don't make it, right? And so then the spin-off to that is that you've got genetic diversity decline in patches because you can't get enough animals migrating into those patches. So that's a real problem. Invasive species. In recent years, introduced weeds and feral animals are regarded as being just as important as habitat loss and fragmentation in these areas. We've got to get on top of feral animals. We've got to do the fox and feral cat and goats and deer, rabbits. We've got to do that control. It's got to happen. And of course, climate change. The increasing temperatures, wildfires, severe storms like the one that went and ripped through couple of 100 metres of 7 Mile Beach National Park on the southern side of it several years ago, flooding and so forth. When we were doing tree planting events in the Berry Bush Links project, we started that project in 2016 and that was drought period. I think some of you probably remember that we went through a period of about 4 years of drought from up to the culmination of the major bushfire catastrophe in Australia at that time. So as a result of that, we ended up planting a lot of our corridors, our tree planting corridors, in low-lying areas because they were wetter. They were still retaining a little bit of soil moisture. And then, of course, as soon as the bushfires were over, being the country that Dorothea McKellar wrote about in her poem, Sunburnt Country and a Land of Flooding Plains and so forth, that all those sites that we planted all got flooded. And so we lost quite a few species and stuff as a result of that, and duly shifted to higher areas again. And I think you've got to be flexible with your project work to work with the environmental challenges that are thrown at you. And of course, there's this issue of non-permanent residents, which I very much came across in both projects in certain areas. And what do your new landholders know about? Do they know how to identify a weed? If they're only coming down on weekends once a month, do they know they've got feral animal problem on the property? These are some of the questions that we're often asking, and how do we get those messages across to those people? Yeah, important that they get those messages though. The video that I want to show you is just a short video that we produced for the Berry Bush Links project, but even though it was targeted at that project, I want you to think about it in terms of it being applicable to the Thin Green Line project area as well, because the similarities are there in terms of how we manage projects and how we encourage landholders to get involved.
Habitat loss, fragmentation and pest plants and animals are the major drivers of native wildlife decline, especially threatened species. From 2016, the Berry Bushlinks project on the New South Wales south coast creates corridors for native wildlife and addresses these threats. Between the escarpment and 7 Mile Beach, we support landholders to protect and connect patches of native habitat through tree planting, fencing, weed and feral animal control.
This area we're standing in is part of the biobanking deal, and so we've got this area and then the new plantings that we've done at the top of the ridge leading down towards the creek, which is part of the Berry Bushlinks project. We certainly see more birds now over here, and as you can hear some of them in the background now. There's been various studies on antechinus's and sugar gliders in the area. We were pleased to see that some were crossing from this patch of bush to the other side of the highway by DNA sampling.
12,000 native tube stock have been planted and 4.5 kilometres of fencing installed.
Linked project funding has helped a lot to help protect the riparian zone down the creek from erosion, something that we wouldn't have funded ourselves.
About 50 private landholders and 18 organisations are involved.
The funding was incredibly important for me and for us here in getting the process started. I'm a rank amateur when it comes to this stuff.
Around 80 hectares of weeds have been treated.
We've got tons of self-seeding with acacias, other cedars and lots of other natives coming through in the area where we've got rid of the lantana and coral tree. With the help of Berry Bushlinks, we were really able to break the back of this project, which at the beginning kind of seemed insurmountable.
We conducted surveys to collect baseline data on native wildlife. Over 200 people have volunteered more than 23,000 hours.
This is Campbell's Run. This is an area that's managed by National Parks and Wildlife Service. We've been working with them as one of our project partners in the Bushlinks project to plant trees around the edge of Coomanderry Swamp here as future food and home trees for greater gliders. From here we can see all the way to 7 Mile Beach National Park down at the ocean. There are gliders tucked under the escarpment here, but there are no other gliders between those two population areas. So it's really critical, not only for gliders but for all native animals, to have that connectivity, to have a network of linked forest areas through tree planting and protecting the existing patches of forest.
We're installing greater glider nest boxes. The population here is quite endangered. They've been isolated for a really long time, meaning that they're very susceptible to sudden extinction or sudden population loss, because there's no new greater gliders coming in to help the population grow. They prefer to have their homes nice and high. So if we can put more hollows in the form of nest boxes in those areas, we can make the population expand within the park and hopefully expand beyond the park, beyond the roads and into other neighbouring habitat. Without that connectivity, without that habitat, there's no animals.
Continued funding is critical to prevent wildlife extinctions. Landholder involvement is vital. Contact Berry Landcare to learn more.
We decided that we would touch on the greater gliders, but we also wanted to talk about the importance of planting tree corridors, protecting existing corridors and linking them as much as possible. And the funding that we provided to landholders included money for contract weed control, for feral animal control, to put fences up. We also produced a landholder guidebook, which is 80 odd pages of really important information that covers all of that stuff and more that new landholders could use, particularly if they didn't know much about the land that they'd just bought. So we found that was quite useful. And the greater glider wasn't the main theme about the Berry Bushlinks project work, but the really cool thing about using the glider is A, it's a threatened species, critically endangered. Its numbers have plummeted since the major bushfires, and it's such a cute animal. The broad-headed snake, Australia's only protected snake, so to speak, threatened snake, listed threatened snake, doesn't have the same gorgeous appeal than the greater glider does, right? We decided the greater glider was a good pin-up species to use to help promote the project. And in that video, when I'm sitting on top of the drawing room rocks pointing out across the area that we were working on, I was basically saying that the population of greater gliders at 7 Mile Beach is isolated, and that there were records of greater gliders just under the escarpment where I was sitting, but there were no records of any gliders in between those two patches of area. And so the idea or the concept of corridors for wildlife works for greater gliders because they need them to survive long term. Otherwise, those isolated patches like at 7 Mile Beach are in jeopardy of being lost because their genetic diversity is going to decline over time. If you can't introduce new genetic diversity into a population that's isolated, it'll crash eventually. And the projection is that they probably won't last more than 100 years. That population will be gone. And it could be sooner if there's another major storm, a major bushfire, if loss of their hollow-bearing trees happens. These are the issues. So the glider and its need, like its isolation and its need for corridors, tells the story for all other wildlife. They all need the corridors to survive long term and to prosper and to maintain good, robust genetic diversity. So the glider helps us tell that story, and it's such a cute animal to do that with. In Robertson, maybe the quoll is your pin-up species. But choose something that works for you, that helps tell the story. And one of my fears is that this year marks the end of the 10-year period of the Bush Connect projects that were funded by the New South Wales government in 2006. There's no word so far about phase 2 funding for that program. $8 million they spent on those projects around New South Wales. Are they going to spend any more money and help promote and continue the work, the good work that we put lots of effort into? And I won't even talk about all the unpaid overtime that I did on those projects to make them work. But we need our politicians and those people in power to know that we want to do follow-up work with that. If you feel passionate about the threatened species that live in this area, and this escarpment area's got it all, these are rich biodiversity areas, and they need protecting so that they remain as corridors so wildlife can move, then you've got to lobby whoever you need to lobby to ensure that we get that funding. Because we don't want to have to look at them and say, well, wasn't that a waste? You spent all that money and you didn't follow it up. So that's my other take-home message, is it's not over until we've saved the species. And there's plenty of them to save, at least 44, and they're increasing. I certainly talked with Katerina about the possibility of introducing some other genetic diversity gliders into the 7 Mile Beach population. So, translocations are not easy. It's a complex area of science. Doesn't always work. It's been tried in some areas and failed, but it's one of the options that's open for the 7 Mile Beach population of greater gliders, and maybe for other species as well. But like I say, it's complex. Ultimately, what we need is a range of different things to try and help. And I think they include, we've got to protect existing patches of forest so that we have corridors into the future. We need to do tree plantings so that we can link up isolated patches and fragmented patches so that those animals can move. And we need to have that kind of foresight of thinking that's well beyond our own generation. And so the tree planting we were doing around Coomanderi Swamp that's in that video, I won't see those working in my lifetime, but I know that by planting those trees and connecting up that habitat, it'll be there for gliders in the future. We've just got to make sure that we keep the gliders in that area and try to keep that population growing so that eventually they can use those corridors that we're creating that we'll never see in our lifetime. So that's the other take-home message, is be bold and plan big, well into the future. I think what our threatened species are really wanting us to do for them. Remember, they're voiceless. They can't tell the politicians or anybody else that this is what they need. We know that. We have to tell them that. When it comes to funding, we often think about government automatically, and I don't think the answer ultimately lies with government, but they are the policy makers. The politicians do make policy and they make decisions. And so one of the ways that we can lobby them is to say, look, there was this Bush Connect program that was started 10 years ago. Where is phase 2? What's happening? Are you just going to let that money that was spent before be wasted, or are we going to follow up on these projects and value add to the work that's been done? I was involved in 2 projects, but there were 16 of them across the state. 16. So lobbying for a follow-up in funding of the Bush Connect program. So there's one. The other thing is to make decisions that are helpful for threatened species, so making policy on things like the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and so it's strong for threatened species and native species. And also, I think that if it's possible to get some funding from government, I think we need to leverage that, whatever money it's possible to get, is important to leverage that into other areas where funding can be obtained, such as philanthropy. There are some very wealthy people that live in the highlands areas, and some of them are right into this sort of stuff. I did come across some of them when I was working in the project previously. And they're interested in this to the point where they would be approachable to contributing to a project that would help threatened species. I worked on one property where the guy said, use my property as a case study. He was quite happy to do that. And this is a guy who's running a global corporation and has the wherewithal to be able to help fund these things. My opinion is that you don't just rely on government funding, because it will never be enough, and it won't pay for all the things that you need in projects that need to work, because you want science involved in it as well. Now, we ran the projects on the smell of an oily rag, and we managed to get 18 research papers produced through either honours students, master's students or PhD candidates through the University of Wollongong involved in both of the projects. So Team Quoll, the greater glider work, the selfie trap stuff, there was some fox work done by a master's student, there was a whole bunch of different research that was involved in both those projects, all very important. Often the work to get funding is done where you don't have anybody as a project officer. Yeah. But if you're successful in getting the funding, then you might be able to afford to pay a project officer to run it.
It's like
so, yeah, it is a bit.
So, I mean,
there is an organisation in Australia called the Australian Environmental Grants Network, and they are relatively wealthy people who are looking for projects to support. We did tap into that with the Berry Bush Links project. It wasn't a huge amount of money though. I was hoping that we could find some more wealthy people to help contribute. But anyway, look, it exists and it's a network, which is good. And quite often they are business owners who are just looking to help support a project. They don't know where the projects are, but through the network, that's the way it works, which is really cool. I did sit down one day and worked out that if we could find a philanthropic person who is prepared to stump up $5 million, my promise to them would be, you keep your $5 million, but invest it for us, and the return on investment each year would fund the projects. And if the whole thing falls over, you keep your $5 million, you can walk away and you haven't lost anything. But that would pay enough to double the output that we were doing with the 2 projects. And I think that's the kind of thinking we have to have. We have to think about that level. And maybe even crowdfunding type sources and various things like that. My problem is I'm not very techo savvy. And one of the things that I did when I was the project officer for the 2 previous projects was I tapped into the intern program at University of Wollongong, and I said, look, I've got a job for an intern, because they usually do about 50 hours minimum of voluntary work associated, and they get points for that in their subject. And I said, I want a tech savvy person who can produce some social media posts for us about the project. So I don't have to know it, I just need to know how do I tap into it. Have any of you seen the documentary on the flow hive? The beehive that was created by the guys up near the Newcastle area. Brother of the guy who did the flow hive with his dad was doing the same job as me, but in the Hunter Valley area with the Great Eastern Ranges. They went on crowdfunding because they wanted to get enough crowdfunding money just to set up their infrastructure to make the flow hives. It was 10 years in development. They finally cracked it and they went, this is what we want to do. How do we fund this? They went online. They only needed something like 21,000 or something like that. $12 million. And it happened so fast, yeah. Absolutely, yeah, it's crazy. So I love hearing this. The next step from here is what do we do? What do we do from here? I've been talking with Landcare in the Highlands about applying for grants. That's been the first step. Unfortunately, that first step hasn't worked well. There's a lot of competition for limited funding. However, for those people who are interested, that have ideas, moon acres, social media, whatever, bit of time, if you'd like to be involved, would you be prepared to leave your name here so that we can get this in with the Southern Highlands Landcare Network? So that's the whole point, is like being involved in the crew that will help run this. So anyway, I'm done as far as the talk's concerned, but if anyone's interested in this, please feel free to come out and leave your name. I'm sure we've got some paper or a mobile phone to capture your details if you're interested. And thanks so much for coming to listen to me, not an authority on the Illawarra Escarpment rainforests.